Well, good afternoon if you are in Washington, D.C., or New York City, or Cambridge, Massachusetts. Good evening if you're in Vigevano in northern Italy. I'm Fred Plotkin. It's Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. Adagio, as you know, is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all over the world. Today is October 27th of 2023, and my guest is Michael Bard, who is, as you can tell if you look at him, a guitarist. And we're going to be talking about the classical guitar in general, how that music is used in many different contexts, but also music in the mind. And that's a topic I'm very, very interested in. Michael, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Fred. Great to be here.
Thank you. I know you're near Washington, D.C.
Yes, sir.
And yes,
I'm in Bethesda, Maryland, which is just outside of our nation's capital. And it's been
is that where the National Institutes of Health are?
It is, in fact. Yes, it is.
So let's go right into the health topic. I was going to save that for a bit, but we may as well go there. One of the things that attracted your work to me and why I wanted to talk to you is that you've been very involved in the use of music and the mind, and specifically cognitive issues, Alzheimer's, and so on. And you've done work and presentations at Harvard. Would you talk about that?
Yes, I actually got involved in a program called the Medical Musician Initiative. I read a book by a friend of mine, who wasn't a friend then, but he is now, Andrew Schulman. He wrote a book called Waking the Spirit. And he's also a guitarist, a classical guitarist who's New York based. I read the book and I was just so taken with it. I had to reach out to him. So I found him on YouTube, and he was in a band called the Abaca Band. So I sent him a note, and to my pleasant surprise, he actually responded, "Hi, it's nice to hear from you. We've got this course coming up at the Berkshire Medical Center in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, in July. Would you like to be part of it?" I said, "Sure." He said, "Well, you're going to need to, come give me an audition just to make sure that you can play." So I met him in Manhattan. We had a nice luncheon. I brought my guitar. I played a few notes for him, and he said, "You're in." And this is essentially a program that is geared toward, in his words, finding the right musical prescription to bring healing and soothing vibrations to the patient. And I said, "Great, that's something I've always wanted to do." I've performed in retirement communities. I've performed at my wife's father's retirement home for the residents, and I always felt like I could do more. So I got involved with that. It was a week-long course, again, at the Berkshire Medical Center in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. And it was very hands-on, very hands-on. We went into patients' rooms, if it was okay with the nurses and the doctors and the families. Of course, we had to get that cleared. But more often than not, I found that playing healing, soothing music for the patients really helped with patient outcome. And not only did the patients respond favorably, but the staff, the administrators, the families, people who were there in the rooms while I was playing at the bedsides of some of these patients were very favorable. And it just said, "This is such a wonderful thing. We need to do more of that." So coincidentally, I went the next year, and then in 2020, everything got shut down because of COVID. So the program, they were thinking about doing it online, but it just didn't make sense. But anyway, that's how I got my foray into playing at the National Institutes of Health 3 days a week, mostly in the pain and palliative care department, the hospice department, surgical intensive care units, the critical care units. And I've got some pretty cool stories to share about my experiences, but that's in a nutshell how it happened. I read a book, I reached out to the author, and he welcomed me with open arms.
Pittsfield is in Western Massachusetts, if I
Western
recall.
Way, it's like 3 hours from Boston.
Right. Whereas Harvard is in Cambridge, which is in Eastern Massachusetts.
Right. Now, my
Did I
work with
read
Harvard
correctly?
is
You did. Yes.
it's totally online. It was an
Oh, I
online
see.
course, Music in the Mind, and I was essentially a guest lecturer who
Okay.
talked about my experiences, while playing at the bedsides of patients at the NIH, at the Berkshire Medical Center. So that I've done a couple of times, but not actually in person. But it was just a recounting of my experiences and stories to the students who were signed up, who were taking that course at Harvard. So it was virtual.
Michael, I'm going to tell you my opinion, and you can agree or disagree, that this is not necessarily a morbid topic.
No.
And life and death and issues of health and illness and so on are part of life. And there's someone that I know from my opera work who I've worked with who has been very public in our community about the fact that all of his treatments for his cancer have ultimately not panned out as we would have hoped, and that he is embarking on dying. And he sort of announced on social media to his group, his friends, that this is happening, and everybody wrote in to wish him well on his journey, so to speak, and to thank him. And he's a religious Catholic, and he's embracing that as part of his journey, and that's great. Most everybody who wrote to him about his impending death. I wrote to him and I said, you're still alive, and that this is part of life, and that even if he's a wonderful singer, if you're not able to sing anymore, you can still experience music and friendship and love where you're living. And he wrote back and he said, Fred, I knew that was you, because it was such a different tone from everybody else who was giving him, in effect, last rites on social media.
Mm-hmm.
Because I really do believe that, the old expression that where there's life, there's hope. I remember vividly Pope John Paul II, who was very public about his suffering, about his physical decline, because he felt that that should be an example, could be an example to other people. He also was profoundly against the death penalty and death and dying as something that could be a choice. I don't think we have to get into that today. But what I'm saying is that each and every person experiences their illnesses and their passings differently. The distinction I want to make, Michael, is that some of the people you play for have long-term cognitive issues, whereas others have death at their doorstep. And I realize that November 1st is the Day of the Dead in Mexico, and that's a whole thing that's observed not necessarily as a negative thing, but as a communing, as a visiting, and so on. So I didn't come here for that reason. I came to talk about the guitar, but I think that music and these very big moments in life, and it's all life until the life is ended, is fundamental. And with this, I'm going to tell you another story. I know that you studied in Vigevano in northern Italy. I've been to Vigevano. That's why I pronounced it correctly.
Yes, sir.
And because I went to college in Pavia, which is not far away.
Yeah, Padua,
And
sure.
no, not Padova, Pavia,
Okay,
Pavia, which is
oh,
very
that
close
one.
to Vigevano.
Yeah, right.
Both rice towns, so to
Yeah,
speak. They're
yes.
very close. And I lived a lot in Milan, and I worked at La Scala, and I became very active in the Casa di Riposo per i Musicisti, the rest home that was built by Giuseppe Verdi for retired musicians, and I'm very active in there. And I believe profoundly in what they do, and that they have their retired musicians who are not necessarily famous, but they were members of the chorus and orchestra of different theaters in Italy, or they were solo singers, or sometimes in smaller roles, but as we know, there are no small roles. And it's a wonderful community. And most of the people who live there, who are residents there, have very active minds, because music has maintained their minds in a very particular way. Some few of them, do have dementia and Alzheimer's, and they've created a separate wing within the building, a building designed by Verdi. And when on a recent visit I went in there, I went to the wing that has the people with dementia and Alzheimer's. And there was a woman who had been a soprano in the chorus of the opera in Verona. I've told this story on I doubt you before, so sorry for people hearing it again. And I spoke to her in Italian, and she was somewhat fumbling in her responses. And then she said to me, "Would you like me to sing something for you?" And I said, "Absolutely." And she sang she was 82, a very good version of Vici d'arte from Puccini's Tosca. In tune, knew all the lyrics, knew the intonation, expressed the drama of the moment of this very famous aria. And I didn't tell her you're singing Puccini in the House of Verdi, but that's okay. And then after she sang, I thanked her, and she said, "For what?" And she had forgotten that she had just sung this aria for me.
Wow.
And so the music lodges and the lyrics lodge in a part of the brain that somehow is separate and maybe last longer than the parts of the brain that retain other information and functioning. And what has been your experience in sometimes playing in retirement homes and so on, where some people are in moribund states, but others are physically robust but cognitively impaired?
Mm-hmm. That's a beautiful story. Yes, I've had similar experiences along that topic, but probably my most visceral experience was at NIH. I believe it was in 2018. Yeah, it was fall of 2018, and I was making my rounds, and I found I walked by this room where a man was sitting, sort of hooked up to a chair with all kinds of wires, tubes, and just looking very sullen, like he had this dark cloud hanging over him. I had my guitar, and the nurses said, "Come in, you play something for our patient." His name is Ron Wilgenbush, and he was a rear admiral in the Navy, stationed in Spain. So I walk in, and I'm just kind of, strumming a few chords, and he turns to me with a very kind of gruff, stern look. He says, "Do you know how to play any music of the Spanish masters, like the Concierto de Aranjuez by Rodrigo?" And I said, "Well, as a matter of fact, I do." So I played through that whole bit of that second movement. The nurses immediately looked at me, looked at each other, looked at him, Ron, and they said, "This man, oh my God, he hasn't smiled or shown any emotion or positivity in the months that we've been here working with him." So I felt really, really good about that. About a week later, I went back to the same floor, and he had been moved to a different room, and his wife was with him, and a couple of his kids were there, and they, of course, waved me in. "Oh, this is Michael, the guy who played Spanish guitar for me," and it really brightened my day, and it just made me feel so good and brought back all these memories of my time in Sanlúcar, Spain, listening to this beautiful Spanish flamenco guitar music. So I went in and I said, "Well, what would you like to hear next?" And he said, "How about a little Malagueña?" I said, "Sure." And so I continued, and then he said, "Can you play some Albanas?" I said, "Sure." "What about Granados?" "Sure." I love the music of the Spanish masters, which, coincidentally, I did not grow up playing. I grew up playing rock and roll, Kiss and Queen and Led Zeppelin and the Beatles and all that. But later on, I studied the Spanish classical guitar repertoire, the Segovia repertoire. But anyway, I got to play for him and his family on several occasions after that. One day I went to visit on my rounds, and he wasn't there. And I asked the nurse, "What happened to Rear Admiral Ron?" They said, "Oh, he's been discharged." "Really?" "Yeah, he's got a clean bill of health. We sent him home." "What?" couple weeks later, I get a phone call from Ron because I gave him my business card. I gave him his wife my business card. He calls me and says, Michael, we're going to have a big party with paella and sangria, and I want you to come play your guitar and just celebrate my clean bill of health. And, I got a new lease on life. And I guess the cherry on top of that story is my wife and I went to the picnic. I played some guitar. Then he had everybody just, please be quiet. I want to introduce, this is Michael Bard, the man who saved my life.
Very nice.
And I got a little teary-eyed and I said,
Yeah.
Ron, I don't know if I actually saved your life, but I think I added to the quality of your life. And I healed you a little bit through this, sonic, mysterious thing that, I've been chasing after for all my life. And he said, well, yeah, you did. You helped me heal quickly and I got better. And if it weren't for your music, I don't know if I would have. So it was a very touching thing to be able to experience that and to share that story with so many people. And it's documented at the NIH too. There's a chart that says, music helped this guy. So
here's a question I've never asked people who do your kind of work. Given that many of the patients that you visit are in hospitals where they're attached to machinery that do measurements of heart rate, blood rate, oxygen, things like that, have you or have medical professionals with you noticed readouts that are different, that are perhaps more steady in terms of what the body wants to do when you play or other colleagues play or sing?
Absolutely, 100%. And I've seen it, and I've heard nurses and doctors comment, oh, wow, look, his blood pressure is stabilizing, his heart rate is stabilizing. And you can see it on the telemetry screens. Some patients, they didn't have those, they weren't hooked up to those screens, but the ones who did, more often than not, and it was especially if I played something soothing and healing, something like the Bach Prelude from the Cello Suite Number 1. The Baroque era specifically just has a really nice sort of heartbeat, heart rate rhythm that most patients respond to positively. So I saw it with my own eyes. I could look at the screen and I could see, the vitals stabilizing. And it was just it is a really very cool thing to experience because, without that, you don't really know. I mean, you hope that what you're playing is beneficial to the patient. But when a nurse points to the screen or the doctor says, oh, wow, look, this is stabilizing and his heart rate is, much calmer and all that. There's something about live music in particular, because I've had some nurses say, we put a radio in there or, an iPod or whatever, and we play music. And it's okay, but something about live music, the vibration in the room, it transcends having a radio or an iPod player there or whatever. And, maybe that's why some of my favorite musicians live to be, long, good, long, healthy lives, like Pablo Casals. He lived to be well into his 90s. Andres Segovia lived to be well into his 90s. You can't dispute the fact that, these vibrations that come from this instrument soothe and heal. I mean, maybe that's why I'm, such a happy guy most of the time, because, I get
and
to
you're
play
92 years old, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, God willing. Yeah, but yeah.
So let's talk. I do want to get back to medical stuff, but I want to take a little detour to Vigevano, because if people know Vigevano at all, they know it for two things: shoemaking and rice. But I knew of the institute where you studied, but most people do not. When they think of stringed instruments for Northern Italy, they think of Cremona.
Sure.
But talk about Vigevano.
Vigevano,
By the way, also, it's a very beautiful piazza. It's one of the prettiest piazzas in Italy.
Yes. Yeah. I was a graduate student, and it was a fortuitous occurrence because I was asked by my professor at Arizona State University to play in a master class for who would become my professor in Vigevano, Carlo Barone. He passed away about a year ago, unfortunately. But Carlo had me play in his class, and after I played, he said, I think you have a good ear, and I said, well, thank you very much. So later that day, I went and saw my other professor at Arizona State. He said, well, Carlo would like to give you a scholarship to come study with him
Mm.
at, it was a very small school, l'Accademia Ottocento, which specialized in classical guitar music, specifically music of the late 1700s into the early to mid 1800s, the music of Suhr, Giuliani, Carcassi, Corulli, the great classical guitar masters. That was known as the golden age of the guitar. So anyway, I took him up on it. I said, yes, I would love to go. So I went it was the summer of 1994, and it was probably the best time of my college career because I learned a lot. I was around students who were much better than I was, so it helped me improve as a player. And just soaking up the Italian culture. It was my first European experience. I'd been only to Canada. That was the only foreign country that I visited, prior to that point. Because, I grew up as a poor kid in Dayton, Ohio, and my parents didn't really have the means to fly me to go on vacations to Europe and whatnot. But anyway, it was a wonderful course, a wonderful experience. And I really got into the music of the golden age of the guitar. And Carlo was a wonderful human being, wonderful professor. And he said, a lot of students write in their music, forte here, or maybe, crescendo here or decrescendo there. But he said, I want you to just feel it. Don't write anything in your musical manuscripts. I said, okay, I'll do my best. So I went, and he just said, okay, play something for me, but feel it. I want you to move to the music and then play it for me. And then, more often than not, he said, you're getting better. You're getting better. So, and I got the same response from some of the other students who I was fortunate enough to be around as well. But the Vigevano, beautiful town, the plaza, oh my gosh, not enough.
It's very large.
Yeah.
It's a very
Yes.
large piazza for such a small town.
Yeah. Yes.
So that the whole city gathers there because
Yes.
all the residents could fit in that piazza very easily.
Right. Yeah,
And
and I
there'll
remember
still be plenty of room left.
Yeah. I remember that was my first experience with gelato. Best ice cream in the world. Oh my gosh, I couldn't believe that. I came back to the U.S., Arizona State, where I was living at the time, in Tempe, and I said, are there any markets around here that sell gelato? He said, good luck, you're not going to find anything. Of course, this was back in the '90s. It's probably changed by now, but just the food, the people, the experience. Italy is and always will be my favorite European country. I just love it.
Mine too. Did you happen to travel to the region of Abruzzo, which is in central Italy?
I did not. However, this summer I was fortunate enough to travel with my wife to Rome and Tuscany, where we stayed, and we were artists in residence, where we played music. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you know why I'm asking you about the Abruzzo?
Why?
Because the most famous pasta dish there is called spaghetti alla chitarra. In other words, guitar spaghetti.
And
the reason for that is that there's a box, sort of a box with strings.
Yeah.
And they use fresh pasta, and they sort of push the sheets of pasta through the box, creating rather thick, chubby, fresh spaghetti.
Wow.
And it's delicious. It's not the thin, dry spaghetti. It's wonderfully chewy in the mouth. Uh-huh. And the device that they use is called spaghetti alla chitarra, and it's modeled after the central part of the guitar.
I see.
So now you have to go back to the Abruzzo.
Well,
I have musician friends there, and they can hook you up with, you'll do a performance in a piazza. They even have a festival of this guitar pasta. Okay. And I'll check with my friends. He's a musician. When that festival is, because that would be a very interesting combination. This gentleman's a conductor. He's been on my show. His name is Dean Williamson, and he lives part of the year in the States, where he heads the opera in Nashville, and the other part of the year he lives in Abruzzo in Italy.
That's really cool. I have not ever heard of.
Yeah, pasta. Look it up, spaghetti alla chitarra. So, not that many years ago, I think it was 2012, I was working at the Verbier Festival in Switzerland, north of Vigevano, basically.
Sure. Yeah.
Very close. And one of the things I did were master classes, public conversations, and so on. but I also collaborated with certain artists on special programming.
Sure.
And one of them was the sitar, sitar player, Anushka Shankar, the daughter of Ravi Shankar.
Right,
We
right.
created a program. I was the narrator, she was the magnificent musician, in which we covered stringed instruments. Apparently, the word is tar, T-A-R, in many languages, going from India through what we now call the Middle East, the Muslim world, the Persian world, the Balkans, the zither in Hungary, the chitarra in Italy, the guitarra in Spain, and how the Roma, the gypsy people who had their origins in India and traveled west and northwest through all the lands I just mentioned, and especially Hungary and Spain and North Africa, created this repertoire of music using the stringed instruments that were used all over there. There was, I'm forgetting the name, but there was a very important version in Syria, where the word tar was meaning string was part of the name of the instrument that they have in Syria. Only in Hungary did it become zither.
Ah, okay.
But in every other place, and in fact, it was the first syllable had the letter I sound, and the second was a tar sound or a thir sound. And so these stringed instruments, especially through the travels of the gypsies of the Roma, influenced music making in this broad swath from India to Spain. And Anushka Shankar very famously plays the sitar, though she played many of the other instruments as well, not the zither, if I recall. And you are at the other end of this rainbow, which is to say Spain, as the exponent of the guitar, as well as Italy. And I'm very glad that we were talking about Italy, because people don't think of Italy for guitars too much. You see it in the Barber of Seville. You don't see it too much in opera. We don't think of Italians with guitars except when they play, as they call him, Bob Dylan.
Right.
Ibithas and
Sure.
so forth, but they don't necessarily, they're not known for their own guitar music, when in fact there's this wonderful classical repertoire that you mentioned.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Talk just about Spain and Italy. The approach to playing, the approach to how you hold the instrument, the emotional, physical, spiritual things that you bring. Not you as Michael, although we could say that too, but you as the musician playing in a Spanish vein or in an Italian vein. What's similar? What's different?
Well, they're both Latin countries, right? So there's that similarity already. But in terms of interpretation and overall sound, I can mostly tell if I hear a classical guitar piece that's by an Italian composer or a Spanish composer. There's that sound that I just detect right away. And maybe it's because I've studied it for so long. I just know. Maybe it would be akin to someone who says, oh, I love the Beatles and the Stones. I know immediately when I hear that's a Stones song, I know immediately that's a Beatles song. But that's a really good question, because I'm actually, as a personal challenge, I was learning the Vivaldi guitar concerto in D, and that's got a very sort of staid, very delicate feel to it. And even the fast movements, it's got a very, nice, upbeat, sort of happy, rhythmic feel to it. When I play, for example, when I was doing the Concierto de Aranjuez, that starts. That's a much more rhythmic strumming pattern. I think what really makes the Spanish style different than the Italian style is the rhythm, especially in flamenco music. If I hear a flamenco piece, you automatically hear it's about rhythm. It's about accompanying the dancers and the singers and the castanet players and the cone players and all that. Whereas I think with Italian music, it's a little more melodic, for sure. I mean, you listen to the greatest operas in the world, and probably most of them were written by the Italian composers. Donizetti, Bellini, Rossini. In fact, I got to play the guitar in the Barber of Seville when I was at Arizona State University with the Arizona Opera Company, and I was so cool that there was a guitar, actually two guitar pieces for in the first act of the Barber of Seville. But the guitar is used as an accompanying instrument. But yeah, you can just feel and hear, at least I can, the difference between the Italian. Italian is a little more light and playful and airy, whereas in Spain you've got the blood is boiling, and one of my students the other day said, I love Carmen by Bizet, but it wasn't by a Spaniard, it was written by a Frenchman. I said, yeah, but it was really, he hit it right on the head, and he was able to capture that Spanish style in that opera. So when I play music of the Italian masters, it's a little more it's less driven, less rhythm, less strumming, for sure. But when I play the Spanish music, it's got a little more force and oomph to it.
Since you mentioned the word blood, it's interesting. In Spain, when I was once in the city of Cadiz, Cadiz, which is one of the oldest cities in the world, apparently. And it's a port city. It's very close to the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. It very close to North Africa as well. And one of the most famous flamenco dancers there was named Pilar de Cadiz. And we've just met, but I can tell you, I'm quite private as a person, but I'm not shy. So when Pilar de Cadiz was giving a performance, and she looked around and was looking for a man to come dance with her. I'd never danced flamenco dancing before, but it didn't stop me from getting up and dancing with this great dancer. And I just followed the music, and I had never studied flamenco. I watched it, certainly, but something in the rhythm got into me. And that, plus understanding that I had to look her straight in the eye to know this. I know from dancing that if you're dancing with someone, it's not ballet, you have to really look them in the eye to know where they're going, what their intentions are, and you become a couple, not through the touch of the hands, although that too, but through the eyes. And after we did our performance, and apparently it was pretty good, she looked at me and she said, "Pero tú tienes sangre," you have blood. And by that she meant apparently that there's something in me that had the flamenco feeling. And it's one of the best compliments I've ever gotten.
That's
when you
great.
when you were studying the Spanish guitar, did this concept of sangre, of blood, come up?
Yeah, there's a thing called duende, which is like a spirit, a ghost. It's a feeling. It's probably akin to that what you just described. And if you achieve that in that sort of setting, more often than not, you'll hear the onlookers yell "Ole!" or in excitement and approval. So yes, there is definitely that. And I think that is probably another thing that makes the Spanish music different than the Italian repertoire. I've never heard someone after a concert in Italy yell "Ole" after I've strummed my final chord, but in Spain, yes, for sure. In fact, I studied in Sanlúcar, which is very close to Cadiz.
Yeah. And one of the many things I love about flamenco is that whole families perform it. So that you will have the abuelo and the abuela, the elderly grandparents, being wonderful, maybe not moving with the same hand gestures and energy of Pilar, but with incredible intensity and passion. But then you'll see a 4-year-old get up and not just jump around like a child, but really dance to the music.
Yes. Yes, yes, absolutely. It had to
Did
be.
you experience that as a player where you were playing and you were playing with families? It's a
I
beautiful thing.
I did as an onlooker because I was
Yeah.
a student studying
Okay.
flamenco. It was a course back in 2005. Gerardo Nunez and his wife Carmen Cortez, but there was always a juerga the night after the classes, a big party, and you would see that where the family would come and gather, and yeah, the kids would dance, but it wasn't just shaking around, being random and being kids. They were actually in the form. They could follow what the other dancers were doing, and I think it's just part of their being, part of their soul. Yeah, so I
And
did.
this brings me back to our first topic, and I did this intentionally, that music, the foundations of music, whether we are professional musicians, whether we are trained in music, whether we're not trained in music, I don't think it much matters. But when the fundamentals are laid down in a very small child, that child through life will have language and movement and energy and duende or sangre, whatever we want to call it, pulse, heartbeat, that's very particular.
Mhm.
And I'm a great prescriber of music for the very, very young, not appreciation, but having it as an alternative language.
Sure, sure.
Because I actually was introduced to music before I was much of a speaker. And it was very, very, it was in my crib, in my cradle, when I was a little child, because my dad was a musician. And therefore, those sounds, those rhythms, the way my body moves, the way I feel music, the way I don't just hear, but really listen,
Mhm.
which is such a difference, happened because of that very early. With my baby food also came the notes. And so I'm bringing this up because the National Institutes of Health is where you live, and or near to where you live.
Mhm.
And do they have programming? And does Harvard and do all these other institutions where you work, perhaps Peabody, which is at Johns Hopkins, just north of you in Baltimore, which has a connection to the medical school there? Are there very early programs for little children, for babies? Not where it's, to make you a genius if you listen to Mozart, but to lay down the fundamentals of music.
When I was there at the NIH, there were not any programs for babies. And in fact, I approached my contact, and Dr. Ann Berger, who was the head of pain and palliative care, and I said, "Is there any chance that I could go and play for the babies and the natal intensive care unit?" And she asked, but they said no. I think we're fine. It's very sensitive area. But and I asked her, and has there ever been any music here for the little babies? And she did some investigating. Apparently, at that time there was not. There may be now. I don't know, because essentially COVID came in. They said basically we're going to have to ask you not to come anymore because uh, it's just not something that we think we should be allowing at this point.
Yeah.
I
I
hope to
would
go.
wonder, and I think that I would love to see funding for something like this as an
Yeah.
experiment. Babies who are what are they called? Born prematurely,
Mm-hmm.
where their bodies are not fully sustained on their own without machinery until they get to a certain age. Um, how they would benefit, obviously not from Led Zeppelin, but from some of the music they were playing, some of
Bach.
the
Yeah.
Bach, some of the Carulli, perhaps.
Sure. Sure.
Um, how they would and obviously not amplified, but just a soft
Just
guitar,
acoustic.
acoustic
Yeah.
guitar.
Just acoustic.
How that would affect, if you could look at the machinery and look at their rates of breathing and heartbeat and so on.
Yeah. I'm sure it would be positive. And I had this discussion with a couple of my friends who were in the Medical Musician Initiative, and one of whom did some investigating. She found that it's the flute, the concert flute, that provides the most healing, soothing result for babies.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the guitar is great too, but for some reason, babies respond more to the sound of the flute. I don't know why that is.
This baby had the trombone. And here I am.
There you go. Right, right. In fact, that you know what? That's actually interesting you mentioned because when I was in the fourth grade, I wanted to take drums, and my parents said no, that's too much noise. So the band instructor was going around all the classes, and he had a trombone, and he had all the kids talk. And apparently, I was pretty good at blowing that trombone. And I went home and I told my parents, and then my sister and brother looked at me and said, "Trombone? Are you kidding? That's such a nerdy instrument. You can't. You have to be a rock star playing the trombone." And then I went back and I said, "Well, what about the guitar? Can I try the guitar?" And my parents said yes. But the band instructor, Tony Pepitone, was so great. He really tried to encourage me to pick up the trombone and join the band. But if it hadn't been for
My
that little
father
dad,
played all kinds of trombone music, which is to say classical, jazz, big band.
sure.
What he had the most gorgeous tone, and I don't say this because he was my dad, but he did. And his particular thing was that he could take the melody from a Strauss symphony and play the melody
Nice.
as if he was the whole orchestra. He
Wow.
could take an Ella Fitzgerald song, or let's say by Jerome Kern or Richard Rodgers, but in the style of Ella Fitzgerald, and play it in her style, but just as trombone music, not as singing. And then he could do the Frank Sinatra version of the same song, and then the Tony Bennett version, and then the Dinah Washington version,
Wow.
all different, but always the same song. And then he could do Gluck a second later. So
Sure.
what I had in effect was a man playing this trombone, but in a very sweet way
Yeah.
over a baby's crib and not blasting it out like, Wagner, Ride of the Valkyries kind of thing. But great though
great.
that would have been. But
Yeah.
in our country, the United States, I wonder what we can do to make music more central, not just in terms of saving, the arts organizations that we love and that I love to support, but as a health initiative. And I think that if we're defined very strictly as a health initiative and funding came from medical resources rather than from arts patrons, although we love our arts patrons, that it might be an interesting thing to develop. I'm very interested also in music and digestion. I don't kind of like music when I'm eating, but I like music after I'm eating. And to see how it favors the digestion, because your blood rate, your bile, your blood type, your breathing, all of that goes into digestion. And I think that it could be done in a way that would favor digestion. There are many millions of Americans who take pills for digestive issues. I don't, but I think I'm just very connected to the physical aspects of music. It's something I care about deeply, and I've done other programs on it. It was one of the reasons that I wanted to invite you. And so I'm just putting this out there for us to talk about, and you please comment. But also that when people see this video, I hope that they will think of it in all seriousness as a medical element and not simply as, quote, entertainment.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dr. Marvin McMillan, who was the former surgeon, head surgeon at the Berkshire Medical Center, pretty much said exactly what you said. It's not entertainment. It's here to heal and to provide a soothing, soft, non-invasive approach to a positive patient outcome. So,
go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that you hit it right on the head when you said that it's not entertainment.
A number of years ago, about 10, I was working in Istanbul in Turkey. And on my day off, I went for a walk in Sultan Ahmet, which is the oldest part of the city, the famous Turkish bastard there, and what we think of as classical Turkish settings was there. And I walked down a sloping hill, and I spotted a musical instrument shop. gorgeous instruments, and I photographed it because I wanted to understand all of the stringed instruments that they had, and they very kindly played some of them for me. And then I saw a wall that looked more like a pharmacy than a musical instrument store. And I asked them, I forget the language we spoke, perhaps German, because many Turks speak German. I asked what that wall is. And they said, this is music and medicine. And very specifically, they had about 100 different medical complaints, from depression to acidic stomach to asthma to weak heart to gout, you name it. They had everything. And they had a different recording of different music on different instruments to address your particular needs. So I'm lucky to enjoy pretty robust health, but I have a couple of weak spots, and I bought the music for my particular weak spots. And I can't say that they improved my condition, but the music was fascinating.
Yes.
And I think this is something that merits a lot more study. The way the Turks, and I think the Chinese in their way too, have decided that certain kinds of music can be applied to very specific medical conditions.
I agree with that. It's all frequency, right? So, and as you said, I'm not going to go into a patient's room and play Metallica or Black Sabbath or anything like that. That would
You're
be
not Black Sabbath.
that would not, that would definitely not help unless they were, Black Sabbath fan. I mean, I like it, but someone who's 85 years old and listen to Mozart or Beethoven probably won't. So, yeah, but that vibration is completely different than, for example, something by Bach, or even something by one of the Spanish composers. So when I was doing my work at NIH, I really had to be sensitive to that. One patient might want to hear Mozart, another patient might want to hear the Beatles, another patient might want to hear Benny Goodman or Ella Fitzgerald. So I had to be able to turn on a dime and find, again, that right musical prescription. Because if I didn't play something that if I played something the patient didn't like, they maybe give me a snarl, or you could see there was some agitation or discomfort. And sometimes patients didn't want to hear music at all. So they would just kind of look at me, and then I would just turn, and I wasn't offended. I just, it's like when you're eating your dinner, you don't want to hear music. Just, I guess, for whatever reason. But I had to be sensitive to that every single time, because I didn't know what I was going to encounter on any given daily basis. There were patients who I would go back and play for repeat times. And I sort of knew what they liked, but some of the new ones, I had no idea. I was just sort of, it was intuitive.
Not too long ago, I was visiting a patient in a New York City hospital, and New York, blessedly, is a place that's very diverse and has people of all religions and no religions. And this hospital had chaplains, had people who are religious workers for all the religions. Because sometimes a person might be not sick as an ill, but SIKH, and want ministering from someone of that religion, or some form of Judaism or Christianity or Islam, of which there are many, and Eastern, which is to say, I shouldn't say Eastern, Asian religions, of which there are many, and South American religions and African religions. And this hospital had them all, practically, or you could request one. What was very interesting is that they would always inquire of the patient or the patient's family if they wanted a visit from a religious chaplain. And some patients said no. And that too was honored, which I found very interesting. And one of the patients I was visiting did not want a religious ministration, but want a musical ministration.
Wow.
And so that they got a musician for him, and who played the harp. And this particular fellow wanted a lot of harp music, and not necessarily angels and wings and on the way out, but rather intense modern harp music. And it was
Wow,
interesting.
that's
And the
that's
musician
cool.
rolled in her huge harp and with the pedals and so forth and played. And it was very interesting to watch this patient who was suffering sort of really focus on the music. So it's
Mhm.
not just that the music, quote, relieved him. I don't know if it did, but it gave him a different focus, the way prayer for some people would,
Sure.
and music for other people, and maybe music for people who are religious. I'm not making any distinctions here.
Hmm.
But I'm now going to turn our topic a little bit in a different way. Many people who are outside the United States don't know that something that the United States State Department, and you live near the nation's capital, Washington, has for many decades, at least since the 1950s and perhaps earlier, hired musicians, artists, performers as cultural diplomats. And Louis Armstrong went to the Soviet Union. Leontyne Price toured in Porgy and Bess in the early 1950s. Duke Ellington, and not just Black artists, but artists from all backgrounds in the United States, were sent in different parts of the world. And I know that you went with your guitar. I have a list of Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Bahrain, and the Kingdom of Morocco. I've been to a couple of these places. And do you think that your music was paired with the places? How did it happen that you wound up in those countries?
Well, it was a friend of mine actually who played at the Kennedy Center in Washington D.C. A guitarist named Corey Whitehead, who's actually the head professor of guitar studies at Cal State Fresno. He was approached after his performance at the Kennedy Center by a woman, Judy Baruti, who worked for the State Department at the time. She said, "We've got these programs where, we book musicians to be essentially cultural ambassadors for the United States. Would you be interested in going?" So um, we were pretty good friends, Corey and I, and he asked me, he said, "Michael, I'd love to go, but not just as a soloist. Can we put some guitar duets together?" I said, "Let's do it, man. Let's do it." So we put together a program of American jazz, some Spanish guitar duets, and a couple of show tune songs, and we went and essentially played mostly, I would say, American music for people who may or may not have been familiar with that music, but it was very well received, very well received. All the countries that we went to, that was the first State Department tour of all those countries they mentioned. And then shortly after 9/11, we were actually approached by the U.S. State Department. "Would you guys be interested in going to Kuwait and back to Jordan again?" And I said, "Sure. It's only music. I mean, I'm not worried about anything happening to me." And we went and we played more of the same repertoire. And not a single concert was a dud. We were well received, lots of great reviews in the newspapers, and we did some radio and TV interviews as well. So I think it's something about music. It transcends, politics and religion and all that. When we played, we got an overwhelmingly positive response every single time, and maybe it's because it was, again, something new that these people weren't familiar with. We played at a lot of the U.S. embassies, and at those countries, it was a mix of U.S. diplomats and foreigners as well. But just a wonderful experience to have had that, not only there, but we also toured Chile and El Salvador later. So I've done 4 of those State Department tours, and taxpayers' dollars hard at work, and I think we made
Good.
a big difference.
That's money well spent.
Yes.
In Chile and El Salvador, which are nations that are Hispanic, in other words, meaning origin of Spain, at least in part, they're also indigenous music. Did you find a different response to your guitar playing than perhaps the nations of the Middle East, especially Jordan, which is close to Syria, which also has a very big stringed instrument tradition, but different?
Right, right. the feeling that we got from the audiences, I felt, again, positive, vibrant, uplifting. But that's a good question because I never really thought about it. Yeah, those nations, El Salvador and Chile, are heavily Hispanic. We actually did learn some ethnic Salvadoran and Chilean songs just as encores.
Mm-hmm.
It's just to sort of tip our hat and give appreciation to the audiences, and those went over really well because they probably weren't expecting. We're playing things like.
That Nadal, Duke Ellington. Yeah.
Most of the concert was that, or some classical guitar pieces, but then to end with like a nice. I can't remember the name of the song now, but it was by Violeta Parra, who was sort of the female Bob Dylan of Chile back in her day. But to pull that out of our hat and play that music for those audiences, it was unexpected, but well received and highly appreciated. So, but in terms of the reaction, I would say it felt to me the same, really, because even though we were playing the same repertoire for people in Jordan and Yemen and Saudi Arabia and whatnot, the people in Chile and El Salvador appreciated it just as much.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the first concert we played in Chile, they were protesters because it was during the APEC conference back in 2004. And there were people
the protesters against the United States.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So they had signs, go home. We don't want you here. Well, as the concert progressed, those people actually came in and joined the other audience, and they were dancing and having just as much of a good time as everybody else. So I don't know. It just seems like music does a lot more good than people might think. And just that instance alone, where you get these protesters who were probably just wanting to, kill you or kick you or whatever, are saying, "Hey, this is actually pretty cool." Because I remember exactly when they came in. We were playing. What is it? Minor swing. Gypsy jazz. That's just something about that rhythm. It's so driving and fun. I just love Django Reinhardt and Stefan Grappelli. But I just remember those people walking through the door, bouncing their heads, going, "This is cool." So, I don't know what they did with their protest signs, but they didn't bring them in. So
Django Reinhardt also being part of the Gypsy tradition that we were talking about before.
Yeah.
Before I get to what you have upcoming, a couple of memories came back to me that I wanted to mention. When we're talking about music and babies, recently, October 12th, was Luciano Pavarotti's birthday. He was a wonderful friend of mine for 29 years. We did a lot of things together. And I posted, rather than on Facebook, rather than post another Luciano video that everybody knows, I posted a video of a baby in his high chair watching Luciano sing for the first time. And the camera remained not on Luciano, but on the baby, and watching the baby's wondrous response to something that he had never experienced before. And that to me said so much more about this music making and the effect of Puccini in this case, and a great voice and a great singer, than could ever be done with a lot of medical journals. That's the first thing. The second thing is that he spent a lot of time in New York, and he gave a concert at the Metropolitan Opera when I was the performance manager. And he asked me to arrange for a priest to come who had done very kind things for someone in his family. And the priest was dying of cancer. And we arranged that the priest be brought from St. Vincent's Hospital to the Metropolitan Opera in basically a gurney. And we brought him down the aisle to the edge of the stage. And Luciano stepped forward. This was a concert, not an opera, and sang directly to the priest. And then the priest was too ill to remain, but we removed him and he was taken back to the hospital. He died the next day. And watching the audience watch this, I'm getting goosebumps now, was extraordinary because you saw what music could do, the directness of the unamplified voice, because I love rock music, a lot of it, not all of it. I love the Rolling Stones in a particular way, and Keith Richards and his guitar playing. And but we're talking here about unamplified, about acoustic singing and acoustic music making. And there's just something very special, very otherworldly that electronics does not achieve.
Mhm.
And I'm very happy that I'm sure you play electric guitar, but remain a supporter and an advocate of acoustic guitar. And you
Absolutely.
have a concert coming up on November 4th. I don't particularly on my program promote people's concerts, but I want to do that in this case. At Carnegie Hall at Wild Recital Hall, presented by Veterans Repertory Theater. What is that?
So Veterans Repertory Theater is based in New York. They've got, I think, 8 or 10 chapters, and essentially what they do is they get vets involved in the arts, whether it be theater, music, poetry, um, painting, whatnot. And it's a way for them to, if they've been, for example, if many of the soldiers have been through horrific circumstances and have PTSD, it's an outlet.
Post-traumatic stress
Yeah,
disorder.
right.
Yeah.
It's a creative outlet.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, one of the performers I'm going to be performing with, Jesus Daniel Hernandez, who actually studied with Placido Domingo, he's a vet. He was in the Army. He's born in Mexico, grew up in Texas, but then served in Iraq and Afghanistan. And he got me involved with Veterans Repertoire Theater a couple of years ago. We did a concert in Chester, New York.
Mm-hmm.
And it was great because you saw all these vets basically performing and, talking about art therapy and how much it's helped their lives. And it was a very, very moving experience for me to be a part of that. So, yeah, they are presenting the concert, and
And you're going
Jesus,
to have, I see, two singers and
yeah,
another guitar player.
right.
You're the lead item on the program.
Mm-hmm.
And I see Bach, Granados, Tarrega, and original compositions.
Mm-hmm.
That's November 4th at 8 p.m. People who want to attend it, I encourage you to do so. It's at carnegiehall.org for purchasing tickets.
And it's in Wild Recital Hall.
Wild Recital Hall, which is a gorgeous space. Have you been there?
I have not. I've heard
Oh
that
my
it's called
goodness.
the jewel box of Carnegie Hall.
When I was a little kid, it was
Yeah.
called Carnegie Recital Hall, and many of the greatest musicians could have performed in the major Carnegie Hall, now known as the Stern Auditorium,
Right.
but would prefer to make their Carnegie Hall debuts in this gorgeous, you'll be amazed, you'll be gobsmacked. I mean,
Right.
I've seen some great, great, great world famous musicians in that little space with its beautiful acoustic in this beautiful room. It's a wonderful place to be doing. I'm very happy. I mean, may you perform on the main stage of Carnegie Hall many times, but I'm very happy that you will also have a chance in this setting, given the kind of music that you'll be performing and the kind of instruments that you're using and vocalists. I think it's something you'll remember your whole life.
I think so too, and I can't wait. It's going to be a wonderful evening, and the performers I'm going to be with are just top-notch, world-class as well. As I was saying, Jesus Hernandez, fantastic tenor. Aurora Daner, soprano, who's beyond her years. She's such a mature artist. And then Ben Schnocke.
Meaning that she's young but very accomplished, not that she's old and hanging on.
Let's hope not, right. And then Benjamin Schnocke, who was a guitarist in my other project, Trio Caliente, which is more of a upbeat sort of salsa rumba band. But Ben lives in Brooklyn, and he's going to be playing a couple of guitar duets with me, one of which I wrote, called Mediterranean Beauty. And it should be a wonderful, diverse diverse musical repertoire that you'll hear
So
that
that's
night. So,
November 4th at 8 p.m. Wild Recital Hall of Carnegie Hall, carnegiehall.org.
yeah, that's correct.
Michael
Thank you.
Bard, it was a pleasure to meet you and talk to you.
Same
And
here, Fred.
I'm
Thank you so
inspired by
much.
what you do, and I look forward to hearing you in performance in person and talking to you, and especially pursuing this idea of music and medicine, which is something I care about very, very deeply.
Yeah, it's so important, and it works. Music really, really works. I don't know why. I don't know how, but it's something about the positive vibration. I don't have to explain this to you. You already know it.
Yeah,
You
but
just got
I want other people to learn about it.
to.
So
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. This
you
has been a
well, thank
wonderful
you.
time. I appreciate your candidness and your overall humor, and just it's been wonderful. Thank you.
As I live and breathe. Would you
As
play
I,
us out with something?
yeah, sure. How about
Well, we lost some of the sound, but that was Mr. Sandman, which is very good bedtime music.
yes, right.
So,
Anyway,
Michael
thank you
Bard,
so much.
thank you again.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Fred.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.